Hello there, and welcome to the third in this little series that we're doing here at Saint-Esprit on spirituality and church architecture. In these initial three videos, we're talking a little bit about the background of why churches have been built throughout the millennia in the way that they have, and today we're going to be looking at the Bible and what influence it's had on church buildings. Now, if you were to be asked which passages of the Bible have most inspired those who've built and decorated churches through those ages, you'd probably first think about the long passages that describe the construction and the furnishings of the temple in Jerusalem that you can see here on the list. Now, those descriptions have certainly played an important role in the design of churches, but there are other passages that have just as forcefully inspired artists and architects right up to the present day. And here's a little list of the passages that we're going to look at in a little bit of detail. First of all, the creation of Adam and Eve that we read about in Genesis, also the Garden of Eden in the opening passages of Genesis, Noah's Ark, a little bit later on there in chapters 8 and 9 of Genesis, the Jerusalem Temple, the life and teachings of Jesus, the description of the celestial city in the book of Revelation. We'll be touching on a few other passages too, like the passages that we can read in the prophets, for instance. So let's begin with the creation of Adam and Eve. In Genesis 1, chapter 26, we read, "Then God said, 'Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness.'" Now, this little verse has had a profound impact on the way that people have designed churches. If you and I are made in God's image, then we already have a template for how churches could look. We're probably already familiar with the cruciform design of churches, that's to say the cross-like design of churches, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail later on. These are intended to evoke the moment of salvation itself, obviously shaped like a cross. But this isn't the only way in which the human form has inspired the construction of churches. Here you can see on the right-hand side the Vitruvian Man depicted by Leonardo da Vinci. That is to say, how does a human form fit into a square and a circle? The square being a symbol of the creation, the circle being a symbol of the divine, the four sides of the square symbolizing the four elements, the four winds, the four points of the compass, and the circle symbolizing the celestial spheres. You can see here on the left-hand side, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, the great restorer of churches in France in the late 1800s, is projecting here how a square can be turned into a circle or a dome. The formation of a pendentive, which is the pieces where we see that the circle is being pointed down into the 4 points of a square. This is the reconciliation of earth and heaven, where the human form, especially in the Renaissance, was considered to be the link in the golden chain between heaven and earth. But this isn't the only way in which the human form has been used in the imagination of the construction of a church. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 9, James, Cephas, that is Peter, and John are described as pillars of the church. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen, and they unto the circumcision. Columns, then, are conceived of as people. Here you can see the classic order of the columns, according to Vitruvius and ancient Greek and Roman architecture, going from what we can see on the left-hand side there, the Doric column, the shortest, the fattest of the columns, transitioning through the Ionic order there in the middle with the curly tops, and then on the right-hand side, the Corinthian column, and the composite column that has a few elements of all of the other columns in it. You can see that these columns actually also are sized according not just to what decorates them at the top, but what the column itself looks like in terms of whether it's got channels running down it or how thick it is. So you can see on the left-hand side the Tuscan column, which doesn't have these little metopes and triglyphs on the top of the pediment here. It's just a blank pediment. This is a sort of Italian form of the Doric column. You can see that it's the fattest of the column because it's supposed to be 7 times as high as it is wide, going through to the composite column here and the Corinthian column, which is 10 times as high as it is wide. It's also more uniform in terms of its profile. Here we can see a slight swell in the Doric and the Tuscan column, to some extent in the Ionic column, but that's diminished here in the Corinthian and the composite orders. Now, these columns, in fact, are, as I mentioned, people, and we can see this graphically represented here in the Erection. The core here, these figures of women, are literally holding up the building. Just like James, Cephas and John are holding up the church. A column is made up of several parts, as we know. First of all, we have the capital, the caput, the head, Latin for head. The column itself here, and as we can see on this slide, the pedestal, the piedestal, the base. Both pedestal and the word base come from the Latin and Greek word for foot. So columns have a head, a body, and a foot. Now, as we can see here, Doric is the most squat of them, or the Tuscan, and the Ionic column is more slender. And Vitruvius believed that this well, I just wanted to point this out to you. You can see what happens when this sort of thing goes wrong, when they're not proportioned a little bit like people. One of the classic examples of this is the entrance to American motels or hotels. They want a very grand entrance, and so they use columns, but unfortunately these columns look as if they might be sort of Oompa Loompas or something, rather squat, and they sometimes seem to be far out of proportion to what it is they're supposed to be upholding. So there's a sort of classic proportion, not because it's supposed to be to do with classical order, you've got to do it this way, but because there is an inherent connection between the proportion of the human figure and the column and what it can hold up. Here is the Doric order, as we can see, the most plain of those orders. And here we can see the Ionic order at the top here, this rather Princess Leia looking headgear at the top of it. Vitruvius incidentally believed that the capital of the Ionic column refers to a woman's hairstyle, gathered together either side in curly buns. And the fluted column here refers to the folds of the maiden's dress, as we can see on the Erection in Athens. There seems to be a direct connection between the drapery on these women's robes and the columns, fluted columns that we can see here in the Doric and here in the Ionic order. Now, the Ionic being, according to Vitruvius, the most female of these forms, is used, therefore, in churches dedicated to Mary. Here, the oldest one in existence in the world, Santa Maria Maggiore, in Rome. You can see here running down either side of this basilica church these Ionic columns with their distinctive curly heads and their slender forms. These, incidentally, are not fluted. They've been repurposed from a Latin temple. The Corinthian column is the tallest and most elaborate column of all, and it's often used to decorate or support the most important part of a church. Here we can see on the right-hand side in the Basilica of St. Peter. Over the high altar here with these barley sugar type columns topped with the Corinthian order. You can see the Corinthian order at the back too, since this is the most important basilica in the Latin Christian world. Some of these composite capitals are sometimes more successful than others, I might say. On the left-hand side here, you've got at the top of the column of the Reptile House in Washington, D.C., rather Romanesque capital with what looks like it could be a frog on the top of it. In the middle here, you have a modern Roman Catholic church dedicated to St. Michael, which has a composite column here. You can see the Corinthian order, a little bit of an Ionic swirl over here, and the sword of St. Michael the Archangel imposed on this column in rather an unusual way, I might say. On the right-hand side here is a Romanesque restoration with a composite column with what looks like a deacon maybe here, or a priest in the sash. And on the bottom here we can see a composite column with the Corinthian order, these Ionic swirls, and the head here in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. While we're on the subject of Roman and Greek architecture and the way it's used symbolically in churches, it's been claimed by scholar and liturgical architect, if we can call him that, Dennis McNamara, that this egg and dart decoration that you can see here on the left and on the right, down here at the bottom, sold by the yard, refers to the birds that were nesting in the Jerusalem temple and in other pagan temples, and in pagan temples too. These eggs were sometimes taken away as a blessing after somebody had made a pilgrimage to these temples, and he suggests that this egg and dart is a symbol of sacrifice and new life coming from what was seemingly dead. So here is the dart, very clearly looking like an arrowhead, and here is the egg moulding that you can see here on the top of the Ionic column and down here at the bottom in this classic marble rendering. You can see this in many places. Let's move on now to the Garden of Eden and how this has inspired church architecture through the ages. From the very start of churches that were purpose-built for worship, they were intended partly to evoke the Garden of Paradise. Here you can see the Garden of Eden with its lush flowers and fruit and wild animals, domesticated animals, from little lapdog down here to the peacock, to the ostrich, and a lovely little stream of water flowing through this idyllic scene just before the fall. When we look at church interiors, like here in the Siena Cathedral, this golden background takes your mind out of our earthly skies into the sky of heaven. Even here, you can see that the stars are not in a seemingly random earthly order that we see from Earth here, but in a wonderful ordered pattern, scattered not randomly over the sky, but in these ranks. Also, you can see in this picture, those stars have been depicted as ordered flowers growing and flowering beautifully. In the background, you see the idyllic landscape of the Good Shepherd here in Ravenna, with Jesus in the middle there, and the sheep that he's feeding around and about. So these flowers and trees and stars are now perfected, and you can see in this particular picture here, the flowers are not sort of randomly scattered, but they're beautifully rendered, as if it's a paradise garden that in itself has been redeemed. We'll see further examples of this a little bit later on. Here you can see that the interior of Gothic cathedrals and Gothic churches are often embellished with this beautiful, luxurious plant life, sometimes evoking a grove of trees on the right here, with its beautiful canopy above in King's College Chapel in Cambridge. And on the left-hand side here you can see a beautiful early Gothic, late Romanesque depiction of these column capitals that have burst into luxuriant foliage as if it was a recreation of the Garden of Eden. Let's move on now to Noah's Ark. The name of a gathering place for the people in a classically constructed church is the nave. This is the same root as the English word navy. The church, then, is intended to be an ark of salvation on the rough and tumble waters of a disordered world. Noah's Ark was built under God's instruction to be 50 cubits by 50 cubits. It was built to save humans and animals from the flood. So people have sometimes thought of churches as these new arks, places of refuge from the world, a sort of gathering place for those who are saved from its ravages, a sort of ship of faith. And here you can see an example of that, of a church in Mosul, a church built as an ark. I'm not sure it still survives after the sad events in that part of the world over the last decade or so. Here's another example of this, perhaps. It's St. Bartholomew's Church in Brighton in the UK. It was compared, when it was constructed, to an ark that was washed up on the top of Mount Ararat. It's sort of massively out of proportion in terms of its height to its width, and some people have compared it to Noah's Ark. Sometimes that comparison has been taken even further, and churches have been built in the form of Noah's Ark. Here you can see the United Church of God in Australia. So you can see that there's a very strong connection between the idea of a church as an ark of salvation, referring right back there to the story of the flood in the book of Genesis, a place where people are saved. If you look up into the roofs of several churches, it does look like an upturned boat in these great wooden beams that we'll be discovering a little bit more about later on. Let's look briefly now. Here's another example of this. In fact, this is one of the first places that Christians worshipped, was in fact in a boat. According to Matthew's Gospel, when Jesus had gone up to give his Sermon on the Mount, he came back down from that place and went into a boat, and this doesn't actually depict this. This depicts Jesus rescuing Peter after he's trying to walk on the water. But when Jesus gets up and calms the storm in Matthew's Gospel, they said that the people worshipped him in the boat. So we have a good precedent in the Bible for boats being places of worship, both in Noah's Ark and in Jesus' life and ministry too. So let's look briefly at the Jerusalem temple, which is described in detail in the Hebrew Scriptures. Here is a maquette of the Jerusalem temple with its axis here from the open court of the Gentiles all the way through to the central building that houses the Holy of Holies. We're told that this Holy of Holies was lined with cedar wood, decorated with gilded angels and flowers and gourds, and these celestial beings that you can see here with two visible faces. We also have a description in the Hebrew Scriptures of Aaron's breastplate, the breastplate of judgment. The ephod, the linen ephod. It was set with 12 gemstones. You can see here what it might have looked like in this little drawing or painting, and on the right-hand side you can see what those gemstones were. These gemstones were intended to stand for the 12 tribes of Israel, which you can see here on the right. Emerald for Levi, peridot for Simeon, carnelian for Reuben, and so on and so forth. Now, when these are ordinary chemicals, all of them, but they've been transformed by heat and by pressure under the earth to be symbols of a new creation, showing that ordinary things can become extraordinary and be used when they're transformed or redeemed, if you like, into symbols of the new creation itself. Now, these beautiful stones that are described in the Hebrew scriptures on Aaron's breastplate have given rise to the use of everything from mosaics to real gems being used to decorate churches. Now, the idea here was that when Aaron put on this breastplate, he was taking into the Holy of Holies with him, not just himself as a Levite priest, but all the tribes of Israel, symbolized by these 12 gemstones. Obviously, the Holy of Holies was quite a small place, not big enough to accommodate the members of the 12 tribes. This is a symbolic way of bringing them into the presence of the Ark of the Covenant, into the presence of God himself. Therefore, whenever we see churches decorated, that's a different subject, with these beautiful gemstones, we can be reminded that we are represented by these beautiful stones too, transformed and redeemed as we are from ordinary material to the crystalline beauty of the gemstones that we can see on the right. Now, I mentioned earlier the Greek order called the Doric order. And one of the marks of the Doric order is the development of these triglyphs, deployment rather of these triglyphs, probably stone recreations at the end of wooden beams that were used to support the roof. So you can see here, over the top of this Doric column, we have these little striations coming down here, triglyphs, where the beams, the wooden beams of the roof that cross over here to support the roof above it, were carved at the end, perhaps as channels for water, perhaps to break up the light on these things so that they look textured in the bright sunlight. And when people replaced these wooden beams with stone, even though they didn't need these triglyphs, they continued to use them, just as those Bronze Age pottery baskets sometimes were made to look as if they were rush. They were made out of grass materials, even though they were pottery. A similar sort of thing applying here to these wooden end beams now created in stone. But some have suggested, perhaps rather over-interpreting these things, that they were recreations of the Greek practice of hanging choice pieces of the meat offerings on the lintels of churches. This comes from the idea that this triglyph is sometimes called, they're sometimes called femores or femurs, something that has been chopped off. Well, that could equally apply to the wooden beams being chopped off at the end, as it could apply to the sacrificed femurs of the animals in the pagan temples. The fanciful suggestion goes so far as to say that these little pegs down here, which would have been used when the temple was made out of wood to hold the beam in place and to stop it from shifting, pegs hammered into the bottom here so that it wouldn't shift off this lintel, were actually representations of the fat and the blood dripping down from these choice offerings that were hung on the outside of the temples. Now, why is this a Christian symbol? Why do people want to over-interpret it in this way? Well, because they say it's a bloodless sacrifice, just as the sacrifice on the altar inside the Christian church of Jesus in the sacrament of the Eucharist is a bloodless sacrifice. So this symbol here It now becomes a Christian symbol of the bloodless sacrifice that goes on in a Christian church or cathedral, rather than in a bloody pagan temple. I'm not convinced, I have to say. Here's an example of it here in the Temple of Concordia in Agrigento in Sicily. You can see the Doric order very plainly here, both inside and in the peristyle on the outside, and on the peristyle on the inside, with these triglyphs on the outside above here, with these little pegs cleanly and clearly visible. Now, in Isaiah and in Ezekiel, we have a little glimpse into the mystical vision of heaven, a heaven inhabited by these celestial creatures who are constantly in perpetual adoration of God, the cherubim, the seraphim, the angels and the archangels. So it's hardly surprising to see these cherubim and these seraphim used in Christian architecture, especially associated with domes that symbolize the vault of heaven above us, the heavenly places. Here's Ezekiel's chariot on the left, and the flaming seraphim of Isaiah on the right. You can also see the wheeled chariots down at the bottom here that are intended to symbolize the cherubim. And here you can see in Hagia Sophia, in modern-day Istanbul, the four-winged seraphim on the pendentives, as we saw earlier in the Vitruvius drawing, transferring us from the dome of heaven to the foursquare of earth. Between we have these four living creatures in perpetual adoration in the heavenly places. Let's move on now to the life of Christ and the life and teachings of Jesus through his incarnation, his transfiguration. What we see here is the life of Christ, various incidents from the life of Christ, attributed to Francesco Zavatari. It's Italian. On the bottom here we can see these small niches. Can you see these? Which contained relics. At the time it's a little altarpiece here, a devotional altarpiece. Now, what we are reminded of in the life of Christ is the redemption of matter itself. When Jesus was transfigured on Mount Tabor, here we can see Raphael's picture of it, his body wasn't transformed into spiritual material or intangible stuff. His body remained his concrete incarnational body. That is to say, that all created matter is capable of being imbued, transfigured, filled with the glory of God, which means that all matter that we use for temples and cathedrals and churches and chapels, our wood, our stone, our precious metals, all of these things are capable of being redeemed and turned into elements that can be used for the praise and the glory of God. So that's one of the most important lessons of the way in which Jesus' incarnation, his life and his teachings have influenced the way that churches have been built. Obviously, we have other examples of this too. Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." He was also a teacher. Therefore, churches need to be arranged in a way in which a meal can be celebrated, Holy Communion can be celebrated, where people go forth and baptize in my name, name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, a place where baptisms can happen, a place where God's people can be taught, just as Jesus taught them in the Sermon on the Plain, the Sermon on the Mount, and through his parables and many other teachings. So churches obviously have been profoundly influenced by Jesus' life and ministry, his transfiguration, his redemption of matter. We can also see here that Paul's letter, actually here we have Peter's letter, refer to Christians as living stones. But Paul also does this when he says you're being built into this living temple. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So we have certain churches being called the Living Stones Church, where we ourselves, just as we're columns, we're also stones too. Whoops. I need to bring ourselves forward again here. Let's move on now to John the Divine and the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, St. John the Divine is given this guided tour of heaven by an angel who's carrying a measuring rod. Here we can see a wonderful depiction of this with the angel on the right and John the Divine on the left. And we have here the elders raising their hands in adoration. And here we have the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament, I suppose, in this medieval Bible. Now, what we hear from the book of Revelation is that heaven is a celestial city. And sometimes some of these churches are built to look as if you're in the interior of a walled celestial city. Of course, this is also decorative. On the right-hand side, you can see the Cathedral de la Maggiore in Marseille. Up top here, you can see St. Peter's Church in Porto Venere in Italy. The stones are available and they've used them to decorative effect. But when you step inside these churches, it feels as if you're in a walled city. These beautiful walls are rising around you, as if they're protecting you with the celestial dome over the top of this celestial city. We're also told in the book of Revelation about the throne of God, about a rainbow, about the 24 elders bowing down in worship, by the water flowing from the throne of life. So we'll see this often depicted in churches throughout the ages. The water, the throne, the rainbow, the 24 elders, the 12 gates also. And the cherubim and the seraphim also make another appearance in the book of Revelation, as do the 12 gems that we saw on Aaron's breastplate in Revelation 4, 2-5, and in Revelation 21, 15-21. So here we can see an example of this in Pisa, where we have Christ himself seated on the celestial throne and this sort of rainbow-like arch above him. Here we can see another example in Santa Prassede in Rome, with this water flowing out from the celestial throne with the living creatures. Do we have the living creatures? I don't see them just at the moment. Perhaps they're depicted up here as seraphim, and the 24 elders bowing down in worship with this beautiful arch over the top of the apse here. And here we have a wonderful example of it in Santa Apollinare in Classi in Ravenna in Italy. Once again, notice how nature has been redeemed here into these beautiful trees, the palm trees on either side, these wonderfully arranged clouds above, and the 12 apostles here being depicted as the sheep, with Jesus as the good shepherd standing in the middle. We can see this often also in icons and in these other beautiful depictions here in a Coptic Orthodox. No, this is Ethiopian, I believe, with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and the 24 elders standing around with their incense burners, with the clouds rising to heaven as prayers. Here again, we can see it in I believe this is English, with the 4 living creatures either side the Christ in a mandala, Christ seated in judgment, with the 24 elders with their burning lamps before the throne. Here again, the depiction of the walled celestial city. And in this particular example, we can see the 12 gates here in these two pictures from Bibles. Here we have the interior of the Armenian Orthodox Cathedral in Jerusalem. What you can see here is the walls obviously are covered in icons, but they're also covered in precious stones and tiles built to evoke those precious stones like cornelian and jasper. The floors are covered in these mosaics that also depict this idea that the celestial city is decorated with these 12 gemstones that symbolize you and me. Here are beautiful examples of it. You can see the mosaic on the floor here. We saw this church earlier on. This image is probably familiar to you. But the floor is not just great slabs of marble put in for convenience, but they're tiny little tesserae, semi-precious stones that have been broken into these wonderful mosaics that evoke for us, here on the walls too, this is all mosaic, it's not a painting, that evoke for us the description of the celestial city and the gemstones of the celestial city. Again, on the left, we see a similar sort of thing with this beautiful coloured marble. It's not just stones that do this evocation of the gemstones, it's also stained glass. It's not just to allow the light to come through and cast pretty colours. It's intended to remind us of the way in which the walls of the celestial city, the heaven itself, is filled with these radiant stones. The stained glass symbolises you and me too. It reminds me of that child's definition of a saint, someone whom the light shines through, thinking of a stained glass window. So these stones, these precious stones, as we saw in the case of Aaron, symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel, and now they symbolize you and me, transformed by the light of Christ into these precious stones that have passed through fire and suffering to become beautiful, so that they reflect perfectly the love and the redemption of God. Here's something else that the book of Revelation talks about. It says that the celestial city descends from heaven like a bride adorned for her husband. On the left-hand side, we can clearly see in this church that there's about to be a wedding celebrated here. They look like wedding flowers, don't they, rather than flowers that would be up there for Christmas or for Easter or something. Maybe Easter, I don't know, but it certainly looks more bridal than anything else. Now you can see on the right-hand side, we have these swags here in stone, evoking this idea that when the bride comes down the aisle, adorned in jewellery and lace and all of the rest of the things that brides wear, that a church is like a bride adorned for her husband Christ. And we can see here that these stone swags of flowers are intended to evoke that sort of idea. When we have a party, a festival, when we dress up to go out somewhere, very often we will hang up banners or streamers to celebrate this idea that we are about to do something that is full of joy, full of happiness and a huge occasion. So churches have been built in this way, not just to provide a pretty piece of decoration, but to remind us that the church actually is the bride of Christ. Here's another example of these floral swags in stone that you can see on St. Paul's Cathedral in London, very Baroque-looking drapes of these wonderful flowers here interspersing the Corinthian columns. Let's look now at the significance of numbers in the Bible. What you can see here is the royal portal in Chartres in France. The numbers 3, 7 and 12 play an important part in the Bible. There are various other numbers, and there's a lot of numerology that goes around. But what you can see here is an evocation of not only the triumphal arches of Rome, that very often had these three arches arranged together, so that when you go into a church, you're remembering the triumph of Christ on the cross through this triple triumphal gate, but you're also remembering the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We'll discover exactly what the significance of this scene here is on the Royal Portal in Chartres when we come to look at Gothic architecture a little bit later on. So look out for the number 3, symbolising the Trinity. Also, here you go, I'm coming soon. This is another evocation of the columns. We're going to look at columns and numbers in a second. Book of Revelation, once again, chapter 3, verses 11 to 12. I'm coming soon, hold fast what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. He who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God. So let's look at these pillars. Columns in cathedrals and churches are very often grouped in numbers that are mentioned in the Bible. We've already seen 3, but here we can discover that the floor plan of the Cathedral of Lisieux, this is not the Basilica of Sainte-Thérèse de Lisieux, this is the Cathedral in Lisieux in northern France, Normandy. You have 7 columns on either side of the nave. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the number 12 also appears often in the arrangement of these columns that symbolize for us the 12 elders, that is of the tribes of Israel, and the 12 apostles that we've seen already in the book of Revelation in perpetual adoration of the Lamb. And here we can see a very good example of that in St. Sergius Church in Old Cairo in Egypt, one of the oldest churches in Egypt. You can see here that we have 12 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It's hard to get a picture of all 12 of them, but they've been arranged in this sort of order around the altar, which is behind what is normally here the iconostasis in a Coptic or a Greek Orthodox cathedral. But these 12 have not just been arranged for architectural convenience, they're a symbol of these columns that are people standing in perpetual adoration as described in the book of Revelation. In Saint-Denis in Paris, we see a wonderful example of this. This is considered to be the earliest Gothic church purpose-built by Abbé Suger, which we'll be looking at a little bit later on. What you can see here is the westwork of Saint-Denis, still looking a little Romanesque with these rounded arches, but here we've got something that looks a little bit like Lancet Gothic. We'll look at that a bit later on. But here in the interior, in Abbé Suger's brilliant rendition of the high altar here with the ambulatory around the outside, what you've got is 12 inner columns and 12 outer columns, as if they're the 12 disciples around the inside and the 12 tribes of Israel around the outside. These columns holding up the church in the most important part of the church here, symbolizing the elders and the apostles in perpetual adoration of the Blessed Sacrament here on the high altar in Saint-Denis. Well, I think that's all I have for you on the way in which the Bible has influenced Christian architecture through the ages, things to look out for as we move forward, beginning next time on the chronology and how Christian architecture developed over the centuries. So thanks for listening. Put any comments that you have or any questions at the bottom there, anything you'd like us to explore further. Thank you for listening and looking forward to moving with you through the centuries to come. Thank you and cheerio for now.